Okay, Chevra, good morning. Why don't we get started? I hope everyone had a nice weekend. We were in the middle of this biurim on page Reish Chaf Ches when we left off on Friday. We left off with a very serious question on the Rambam that is discussed by the Meforshim, which is that the Rambam states what we learned in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, which is that a person who leases real estate has the right to lease it to others, has a right to sublet it to other people. But in a different section in Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says that if a person leases a field for agricultural purposes, let's say, to farm a piece of property, he does not have a right to sublet it to other people. And the question is, what's the difference between a house where I do as a lessee have the right and a field where I don't have the right? And it seems to be that there should be no difference. We saw from the Drisha and the Sma, the Drisha is a commentary on the Torah, and the Sma is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And they both pretty much say the same thing, and we'll just quote from the Sma. He says, Uchein ze kosav nami hasma. Let me just move this down here. Simin shin tezayin sifkat and aleph is elushana. Below amru de'ein hasocher rashai lahaskir ki im b'metaltalin shema yavrichem shomer hasheni v'ovdem. He says the only time that a leaser, a lessee, does not have a right to sublet is with chattel, because maybe the second lessee, the subletter, right, will lose them in some way. The gam besada mishum shema yachishem, and a field, an agricultural field, could be weakened because the second lessee could choose to plant something that will deplete the nutrients from the soil. Mashein came b'maskir beso, diachol laharos local prati inyane beso. But when it comes to renting out an unfurnished house, remember it has to be unfurnished. He says the owner can show the lessee all of the details of the house. These are the windows, these are the doors, these are the walls. I expect them to be in the same condition when I get them back. It's much easier to stipulate what your expectations as an owner are, and therefore, because it's much more concrete, so to speak, it is therefore permissible for the lessee to sublet the property. He says, "Ulam lanias daiti devarv shel hasmahim temuhim ve'enam muvanim." He says, but the words of the Sma I really don't understand. Daha kemo b'metaltalin avsha hasocher o hashoel kibel alav achrayas kedino legabe haba'olim. He says, because think about it. When it comes to chattel, even though the renter accepts full liability, and he has the same, he has all of the obligations to the owner, b'miyovdu yitva osam mimenu, and the owner always has a right to take legal action against the person who leases his car or leases his animal. When we call makom amrinan v'yachol hu lomar ein ritzoni sheyeh piktoni biyad acher she'eino neman be'enai. And yet the owner still has a right, despite the fact that the lessee has assumed full responsibility, full liability, the owner still has a right to say, I don't want my car or my lawnmower or whatever the case is to be operated by another person. I only trust you. And that's even if the lessee guarantees that he'll be completely liable for any loss or theft. Like what difference does it make to you who's driving your car? I'm assuming full liability. And yet the Balabayas still has a right to say, no, it's my car. I don't want other people driving it. He has that right. He says, why then does a homeowner lose that right when it comes to people who he chooses to live in his home, right? Why doesn't he have the right in that situation to say, I just don't want other people living in my house. They'll bring bed bugs. They're not going to be as sanitary as you. Like he can make up 100 reasons, right? He says, even when the lessee shows the subletter all of the conditions of the house, and to require him to return the house intact, the same condition that he received it in, but any property that is subject to damage, which is going to cost money to repair, and you know, that's true for a house as much as it's true for a car, as much as it's true for a field. Imkein maishna bein metaltal and labayis. Ari gam metaltal and efshul hasnos velasu shtar al shavyusu v'chulei umikol makom asur lahaskirim lahashilim. Now, he says, but why then should there be any difference between a house and a car, or a lawnmower or a cow? In all cases, in the case of chattel or in the case of a field, regardless how well delineated the terms of the lease are, and how many photos you take of the condition of the item that is being leased, the lessee still does not have the right to sublet it to somebody else if the owner does not give him permission. Why then is a house different? And that's really the question, okay? So it's still a question on the Rambam, and that's where we left off last week. Bahamistaver lomar b'shitas harambam hu mashakosov hamagid mishnah perak hey hilchos hey deschiris v'zelusham. He says, it would seem to me, now, by the way, I would, if I was pushed at this point to answer the question, I would say that I could make the following distinction. Wear and tear on a movable item or a field is much less concrete or descript than wear and tear on a house. There's only so much damage you can do to a vacant house, and any damage you do to a vacant house is easily identifiable. That's what I would say if I was pushed to answer this question. In other words, you break a window. Okay, so it's clear that you broke the window, and it's clear that we can repair the window. And also, when the window is repaired, you generally restore the structure back to its original condition. Okay, it's much more easy to address damage and to identify damage and to repair damage when you're dealing with a structure than it is with a car. You know, a guy who drives my car but is a reckless driver and deliberately drives over all the potholes on the road, it's not as easy, or does the same with an animal. It's not as easy to say you created a certain amount or dollars worth of damage, because it's only over, it's a gradual erosion of the rack and pinion, whatever that structure is in the steering column, and all of those other things. It's a lot more difficult to sort of identify the wear and tear on. And then the same thing I think you could argue for a field. But that's what I would have said. But let's see how Rav Stern is going to answer it. He quotes the Magid Mishnah, and he states as follows: "Umikol makom ta'anosam chalusha ma'od, shahareze hasocher hasheni im hizik yishalim, ve'ein matzui hezek bekarka, sheyomer bo ein ritzoni sheyehi pigdoni biyad acher adkan lashana." So he says that this is a weak argument, the argument to suggest that with real estate, there's more wear and tear possible because of the weakening of the nutrients versus a house. He says, why? Because the second lessee, if he damages, he can always pay. And it's not prevalent to find that kind of damage in real estate, in a field. where the owner has a right. Why should the owner have a right to say, I don't want it to be in someone else's possession? In other words, the Magid Mishnah is bothered with the same thing. But he says, V'kavanos olomar, but what he means to say is, the af shagam bebayis shayich bo hezek, b'kol makom eno matsui kolkach. He says, even though structures can sometimes retain damage, but it's not as prevalent. B'kevin she'eno matsui kolkach, ein biyado la'akev es hasocher milahaskir la'achir. And since it's not so prevalent to retain damage in a structure, the owner cannot prevent the lessee from leasing it to somebody else. And that's the argument. It's not as common. It's much more common that there'll be wear and tear on chattel. It's much more common that there'll be wear and tear on an agricultural strip of land, but it's not as common. It's not as prevalent that a house will sustain damage. V'hinei after das hayesh mi sha'omer she'evi harambam eno yichida v'gam das hamordechai hukein. Now, the Rambam had originally quoted, we had seen this on Friday, the Rambam had quoted an opinion that says that when a person leases a home, he doesn't have a right to sublease it. Even though the opinion that the Rambam brings is not a lone opinion, and the Mordechai actually paskins that way. Ayin darchei Moshe reish simin shin tezayin mikol makom ladina nifsak b'shulchan aruch Rambam. Nonetheless, the Shulchan Aruch paskins like the Rambam that a lessee of a home or a structure does have a right to lease the talmuds. V'chein hiskimu shar haposkim to bebayis rashai lahaskir la'achir. And that's how the other poskim have come out, that when you lease a property, like an apartment or a house, you do have a right, no questions asked, to lease it, to sublet it to somebody else. Ulam lamaisa, yesh ladun bezel le'inyan hasholas bayis bizmanim. What I would like to consider is whether that still applies in modern times. Does that argument that it's not as prevalent for an apartment or a house to sustain damage, and therefore the owner cannot prevent the lessee from subletting it, does that still apply today? The hakavar mevur le'el sof divrei maschal hasocher dezeh amur dafka bebayis reik she'ein bo rehitim u'metalfim. Because first of all, as you recall, we already established that we're dealing with an unfurnished apartment or an unfurnished home. Obviously, if there's a home that's furnished, then of course it's a house filled with metalfim. It's a house filled with chattel. So there, the owner can say to the lessee, I've got an expensive dining room table, I've got expensive chairs, I've got a cabinet that has glass doors, and I don't trust other people to be responsible with these pieces of furniture. Ula mashi yesh la'ayin bazeh, the harei kisha'adam mashil bayis bizmanenu, hu eno begeder mashil bilvad, elagam nosein matana. He says, what we should consider is that when you lend someone your home to live in it temporarily, you're not just a mashil, you're not just lending them something, but you're also giving them a gift. Shaharei, and what's the proof? Shaharei hamayim v'hachashmal v'gaz shahashol mishtamish bo ole lamashil kesef she'enu mekableim chazara mehashoya. He says, when I let you stay in my apartment, let's say I'm going away for Pesach and you need a place to stay, and I say, sure, stay in my apartment. You're consuming goods while you're staying in my apartment because you're using my water, you're using my electricity, and you're using my gas. The imkain sarach iyun tuva bazeh. He says, so let's consider that. There are goods being consumed anytime you go into a modern home. The yesh lomar the dafka bischus yishtamshus kaimalon dehecha de'ein hashol yochol lahavricham rashai lahashilo. He says, maybe only when it comes to the rights of usage do we say that a borrower can lend to others. But where the owner is losing goods, such as water and electricity, who says that just because I have a right to use his water, I'm allowed to let other people consume his water. And therefore, maybe even when it comes to structures, we could say that the owner is only allowing this guy to use it and not someone else. And it's not like just when it's just the structure in question that it becomes totally the purview and the rights of use belong to the lessee or to the borrower. Because what we basically, the attitude of the Rav Shulchan Aruch is that when someone lends me their home, I become sort of the owner of the home during that period of borrowing. And therefore, I have a right to give it over to somebody else. But when there are consumables within the apartment, such as water and electricity, and I haven't yet consumed them, you can't say that I own all of the water that's coming into the apartment. I own all the electricity that's coming into the apartment, such that I have rights of giving it over to other people. So who's to say that I can give over the utilities to others? Let's say, for example, Reuven turns to Shimon, who is a guest, comes from a faraway place. Let's say Reuven says to Shimon, here, I'm basically extending you credit that you can put your food bill on my tab when you go to the market for a week. And Shimon ends up not needing Reuven's good graces to put his food bill on a tab at the market because he ends up not staying. Would we ever suggest that now Shimon can go to Levi and say, Reuven gave me the right to put my my grocery bill on his tab. Go ahead and you can use that. Of course not. It would seem obvious that he doesn't, that's non-transferable. It's not a transferable right. Because it's not something that you've given me already. You just said, if you need my credit, I hereby grant you my credit. So you don't have a right, therefore, to transfer it over to somebody else afterwards. We'll skip the parentheses and skip down a few lines. He says, Va'afti yesh makom l'chalek bein hadvarim v'lomar dahacha b'dira shehu shelo l'meshech zman mesuyam nikna lo al yedei zeh zchus ha'ishtamshu shel hadira. Even though one could perhaps argue that when you rent or borrow a house, you have now all of the rights of usage of that apartment or that house, including the utilities. Shuhu kolel b'socho hishtamshus b'mayim chashmal v'gaz, that includes the water, the electricity, and the gas. V'af shehem lo hayu adayin b'dira shenomar sheniknu yachdim kinin adira. And even though they're not physically part of the structure, that we cannot say that you now own those utilities, but they are still considered to be connected to the rights of usage of that apartment. But it would seem to me to be more accurate that when a landlord gives rights to a lessee to use his apartment and he includes the utilities, he's basically giving the utilities to the lessee, and obligating himself to give those things to the lessee should the lessee require them. Shabo kaimalan dimruven eno chafetz bo in biyadu lahabir adaber lachaber lachayiv abalabayishin ulashimin. And therefore, it's non-transferable. Reuven can't say, I have the rights to those utilities, and therefore I can transfer them to Shimon. Shaharei lo yischayv elo leReuven v'uadin hachim Reuven eno dar b'dira eno rashai la'avir l'Shimon b'li haskamas habalim. And therefore, if Reuven chooses not to live in the apartment, he cannot, without getting permission, give it over to Shimon. Ulamim Reuven yomer shu mekabel alatzmo l'shalem hotzaos hanal efshar derashai limsolos adira b'li l'sholos habalim bayis v'tzarachiyim. But maybe it would change, he says, what if Reuven, the lessee, says that he's responsible to pay all the utilities? And that could actually change the halachic position. If Reuven says, let me borrow your house and I'll pay for all the utilities. And Reuven says, fine, whatever bills come in over the next month, you're responsible for, and go ahead and feel free to use my home. It could be Rav Stern wants to suggest that in that situation, the Balabayas does not have a right to stop Reuven from leasing it to somebody else. But he says, Tzarachiyun, it requires more analysis. I'm not so quick to give that permission. So it's almost like Rav Stern has found like an exception to the halacha based on the modern situation that we deal with in the world today, which is to deal with utilities that come into the home, such as water, utility, and gas, water, electricity, and gas. But were it not for that, perhaps the halacha would be like the Rav Shulchan Aruch says. So we are left with basically the suggestion that in modern times, especially when the homeowner is paying for the utilities, then clearly a person does not have a right to sublet the house to other people, even if there's an understanding that part of your rent is going towards the utilities, because maybe the owner could say, I only want you to use it because, I feel that you're using a certain amount of utilities, you do a certain amount of laundry, you take a certain amount of showers. I'm not convinced that other people are going to be as responsible with water usage. Like, maybe I know that you're a conservationist, and that's why I'm letting you use my house. But I don't necessarily trust another person to be as conservative with his utility usage as I trust you. So that in itself is enough of a reason to change this whole halacha. And therefore the conclusion is that in most cases, whenever I lease a property, I do not have a right to sublet it to other people unless I get express permission from the balabais. Okay? Comments, questions? Correct.
Could you repeat that, please, Rabbi?
Yeah, so one second.
In that case,
so Lloyd is asking, what if in the lease contract it states explicitly that the lessee is responsible to pay for all utilities? Could then you make the argument that he doesn't have to ask the landlord to sublet it to other people? Rav Stern equivocates on that matter. Okay, he equivocates. He's not sure. That's why he leaves with Tzarachiyun. And the reason why he leaves with Tzarachiyun is because even though the Shulchan Aruch has paskin that there's only limited damage that can be done to a house, and therefore there's no reason to restrict the lessee from subletting it, or like I argued, it's clearly identifiable whatever damage is caused. But there are other opinions. He quotes the Mordechai, and he quotes another opinion of the Ravid. And it seems like there is another opinion that says that regardless of the difference that one would want to draw between real estate and chattel, you should never lend something out or lease something out that's not yours unless you get permission from the owner. And so based on that, that's why he leaves off with it Sarachim. But usually when you sign a contract that says that you're responsible for all utilities, there's usually also a clause there that says that you're not allowed to sublet it without permission. So remember, I mean, obviously you have to abide by all the terms of the contract that you sign, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest, Rabbi, that I guess no matter what the halakha says based on silence in a contract, you can always put in the contract you can't sublease, and that would take care of it.
Correct.
Yes.
And conversely, you could also put in the terms of the contract that you do have a right to sublease it,
Right. So what we're learning here is only if the contract is silent with respect to that. What
that's right. That only if the contract is silent, or if there's no contract, but it's just talking about Yankel, who's the owner, is a friend of Reuven.
Right.
And he knows that Reuven is coming for Shabbos, and he wants to know if, and Reuven just wants to use his house for the weekend. And then all of a sudden, Reuven gets a call, and his cousins are coming into town also. So can Reuven now invite his cousins to stay at Yankel's house without asking permission? That would be a much more prevalent kind of situation. So let's consider. We would probably not need the Shulchan Aruch to tell us, what the, or the Imrei Yaakov to tell us, because remember, one of the provisos was, going back to the top of the page, uvilvad shelo yiyu b'nei veso merubin mipnei beso shel hasocher. He says that even the opinion that says that you are allowed to sublet without asking permission, that's only provided that the sublessees are not greater in number than the lessees. So let's say Yankel gives me permission, my wife and I permission to stay in his house for the weekend, and all of a sudden my nieces and nephews want to come as well. All these bunch of little kids. Of course, I'm going to have to ask permission in that situation, because if anytime I'm adding the number of occupants to a property that was not acknowledged yet by the owner, I have to get express permission, even according to the lenient position of the Shulchan Aruch. Okay.
I think it also depends on how long you're subleasing for, because if it's for a longer period of time, I think there could be infrastructure damage done. Someone leaves the water running and then there's toxic mold and stuff like that. Like it's not as if there can't be things that are done to a house that won't be apparent right away, but could be of a long-term nature.
I think that's a good argument. I think that your point is, the point that Paul is making, is that in a house in the medieval or ancient world, there were no indoor plumbing. There were no gas lines. There were no electric lines, and as such, it was much more identifiable what kind of damage was being done to the actual structure. You got windows, you got doors, you got walls. That's it. You got a floor. Usually the floor was a dirt floor. But in today's world, there are so many additional features to a home. There's damage to pipes, there's damage to electric, there's damage to gas lines, there's damage to floors, there's damage to molding, at the edges of the floor. There's carpeting, and even though all of these things halachically count as real estate, but there's so many more things that are subject to damage and wear and tear in the modern home that didn't exist in the homes that are being discussed by the Shulchan Aruch, that it stands to reason that this halacha would not apply in modern times, that a person doesn't have to ask rishus. Okay. All right. Well,